We do not hear enough from the Lib Dems about their position on the ECHR and the illegal crossings of the English Channel. Over to our political editor, Christopher Hope.
That's right, Nigel Farage. Now, with me now is Max Wilkinson, who's Lib Dem MP for Cheltenham. Max Wilkinson, your manifesto last July said this: "We will champion the UK's Human Rights Act and resist any attempts to weaken or repeal it." If so, how would you stop the boats?
Well, good evening, Christopher. Thank you for having me on. I think the important point we've got to note here is that nobody is suggesting that the migration system currently works very well, and nobody is suggesting that the kind of levels of migration we've had over the last few years have been sustainable. But the small boats crisis is but one part of those figures. Now, the reason the system isn't working very well, we all know, is because the Conservatives, after Brexit, put in place an immigration system that frankly didn't work. And then with the massive distraction of the Rwanda policy, we ended up with a huge backlog of asylum seekers and people claiming asylum in this country. Now, that is why we've got hotels in our town and city centres up and down the country. The Liberal Democrats are actually against that. But one of the things we've got to remember here is that actually these people are human beings that we're talking about, and they do have a right to a fair hearing too. So it's important that we get the system right, that we get it works.
Yeah. But they're Max Wilkinson, they're human beings who were in France. There were human beings in France, weren't they? Why not stay in France? Why are they being allowed to cross the channel? When they get here, we then try and send them back as a government, and we're told we can't do because their rights to family life or private life under Article 8.
Well, if we look back to what happened in the Brexit referendum a few years ago, many of your viewers will have voted for Brexit to get better control of our borders.
You keep mentioning Brexit.
Well, it is, and if you let me finish, Christopher, If you let me finish, Christopher, this does go back to Brexit, and actually I think it was mentioned just before the break there. Actually, when we were in the European Union, we did have the Dublin Agreement, which meant that we had agreements to return people to other European Union countries, and the Migration Observatory from Oxford is now reporting regularly that there is a Brexit effect because we are not subject to those relationships that we had before. There are people who can claim asylum in the European Union. They can then be turned down, and because we don't have agreements on things like fingerprints and sharing of those databases, they can then come to the UK and have a second bite of the cherry. We in the Liberal Democrats think that's wrong and it's absurd.
And just so we're clear then, that the Labour government is going to recommend tweaking Article 8. You would vote even against that, even though a slight change, which may make no real difference, it could work, it may not work, you'll vote against that, would you, in the House of Commons?
Well, the point here is that leaving the ECHR is going to make absolutely no difference to the problem that we've got here. The reason we've got a backlog of asylum cases in this country is because the Conservatives broke the system, and in part as well because Nigel Farage, whose show this is this evening, and I thank him for having me on, told us that Brexit would help us, and it's actually made things so much worse. What we need to do is focus on getting the process right. We need to make sure that the Home Office has a separate department that is dealing with this, because clearly the Home Office hasn't done very well over the last few years. And actually, if we look back at what the governments have been doing of both colours, we've had an Immigration Act basically once every year. That hasn't solved the problem. We do need to get that backlog down. We need to make sure that people are processed fairly, and if they have a right to stay, they get a right to stay. But if not, then they're going to be returned. OK, Max Wilkinson, Lib Dem MP for Cheltenham, thank you so much. Nigel Farage, it's all your fault.
I know. And as I said earlier, before the break to Kevin, you know, if you're a Brexit voter, you really are furious about this, because one of the reasons you voted Brexit is you saw millions pouring across the Mediterranean and said, we don't want any part of that, particularly after Mrs Merkel. Now, we talked earlier about fairness and what's right and what's wrong. This will upset you at home, many of you, I promise. Almost 200 people who have been processed through the Manston Centre are now suing the British government using our old friend, the ECHR, because they say they've been kept in terrible, disease-ridden areas where there have been outbreaks of diphtheria, scabies, etc. And there was a case last year where somebody who was detained, the court decided unlawfully at Brookhouse Immigration Centre, was awarded £203,000 in damages. So let's get this right. You break into the country illegally. We take you into Manston, where, by the way, I hear the levels of violence against staff are reaching levels where virtually no one wants to do the job. And then using ECHR, you can sue the government for 200 grand. It's crazy.
Well, you
you can always pick out cases like that, which are...
There's 200 people here.
Well, but... The cost you've just flagged there to any law-abiding British taxpayer is offensive. In the same way that the Labour government is very serious about those asylum seekers who infringe our trust and commit crimes, as we saw in Epping, equally sometimes we have to say that not all of these people are criminal. Christopher referred to the Labour government committing to reviewing elements of application of Article 8, because some of this stuff doesn't make sense and needs to be looked at. And the new Home Secretary, the Labour Home Secretary, people don't talk enough about her. She came in and she's sorted out the prisons, done a really good job in a year, and now she's on this. And I'm really happy about that.
That's very interesting. So, I mean, the reshuffle, I mean, we have a whole programme on that. I was looking at it. It was of a scale that was extraordinary. Hardly anybody stayed in their post. Do you think the new Home Secretary gets this?
She definitely does get it, but even more important, she's going to do something about it. I mean, she's not a woman she's not a woman to mess with. You know, I want to be on the side. Look, can I go back to where you were started? You say they're suing the government. They're going to try and sue the government.
Yeah.
Anyone can say that. Anyone can go to the press.
Well, but the precedent was set last year from Gatwick.
But the one person you've quoted, you also said they were unlawfully detained. Now, that's different, because most of those people there are lawfully detained, and there's a big difference. If we unlawfully
Shouldn't
detain
they all be detained
someone,
until we can work out who they are?
Well, presumably this person shouldn't have been. You say they got compensation because it was unlawful. Yeah. But the rest, they are lawfully detained there, and they're going to try it on. But the big issue, as Kevin just said, is we have a backlog. We have to deal with them. We need the staff to deal with this. And on the family one, I mean, just because someone says they want the right to the family life, which I agree with, but they can still go back to their country of origin and take their family back there with them. I mean, it doesn't make...
If that worked, that'd be fine.
But we have to do it.
But it doesn't work.
Because we're not trying, because we've got a backlog.
Hang on, because Article 8 gets... Frankly, with the backlog, the easiest thing for government now is just to wave them all through.
No, it isn't. The easiest thing is to make sure that the cases are heard. At the moment, they've got a right to be heard orally twice. Well, I don't see why the appeal can't just be a paper appeal, and that could be done very much more quickly. So, I mean, it's really important we deal with this now, not in a year's time, not in 2 years' time, not even when you want to be Prime Minister, in 7 years' time.
And on the money, the money point is really important. And what doesn't get talked about enough is that already the Labour government has cut back on hotel spend by £1 billion a year, and it all adds up. So you're right to talk about the outrage that people feel about this, because ultimately those of us working hard, those of us in business are paying for it. But Labour is already making inroads, but we accept it's not happening fast enough.
Well, you can close the hotels and come into a street near you. It's a house of multiple occupancy.